Welcome to another episode of It's Not You, It's the Media. This week's podcast is absolutely important because it's a reflection of what's happening in the United States. The series of arrests, the detentions, the paranoia, the anxiety, the fear around what's happening to students across the country, many immigrants, and also conversations around legality and illegality. So, we decided that we will do an in depth deep dive into what it means for us to think about visas and border regimes in the United States. We have a brilliant journalist, Tanvi Misra, joining us in a few minutes. But before that, Bhakti, Madhuri, and I decided that we would have a deep dive into what's happening or what's happened since the Trump administration has come to power and what are the consequences of what it means for us as they continue to unleash new and new regimes of terror. And that's exactly what this is: these arrests, these detentions, public sharing of images, the spectacle of these immigrants being kidnapped, the spectacle of these shaven heads of all of these people who have been disappeared. So there's a lot to cover, but let's quickly jump into it. Bhakti, what is it that
Yeah.
has been occupying your mind with all of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's of course been a very disturbing moment because, of course, it's everybody I know, which is academics, which has been my career and life for a long time. And it's very distressing to see, that all the things that I sort of know well, people in Palestine organization in terms of activism and so on, people in academia, and then of course people like me who have been on visas and have been through various types of statuses over the years, who come from somewhere else and who have made their home in the US and so on. And I think one of the things that's upsetting to me, and I've said this before when we talked about migration more broadly or border regimes more broadly, is just the sort of shock that people feel that they've never heard of this thing called the visa, right? So if you're thinking of Americans traveling to Europe or something, they don't need a visa. When they go somewhere else, they may need a visa, but they can quickly get it online. But the kind of visas that
Right.
students have to go through, that economic migrants have to go through, the process, the dehumanizing process, the biosurveillance, the extraordinary levels of humiliation in terms of having to reveal, like, yours and your family's life savings just to be able to get an appointment, for example, to get the visa. Then you get to the appointment and you have all kinds of other crazy things, humiliations, depending on what the officer is asking. And it's just a horrible process, and I think people don't know very much about it, and suddenly that's come into light because everyone's like, wait, does she have a green card, the person who was kidnapped? Does she have a visa? What's that? What kind of visa? And all of this is extremely infuriating, and also I feel horribly powerless in terms of just literacy, or
Yeah.
what information should be put out, what can we do?
Yeah. I mean, I'm very much with the both of you, Bhakti, specifically what you said about the literacy aspect, the border regimes, visa regimes, immigration. These systems, I think, are designed to be bureaucratic and incredibly opaque. And we. When you're in the system for as many years as many of us, we think we really know the ins and outs, and then you realize you absolutely know nothing. Especially, this was what I felt when this ancient law was unearthed, and I have kept getting the sobering reminder that laws are only as good as the people that implement them. And so
Right.
far, we have not had this kind of an attack on. I mean, on the show we've talked a lot about the futile distinction between illegal and legal immigrants, but we have not had this kind of concerted attack on green card holders who are permanent residents of this city, of this country. We have not had this concerted attack on students. We have in the past, but not this sort of a, you wake up in the morning and you get an email telling you to self deport, or that that USCIS has gone into your SEVIS, your service account, and stripped you of your status. So there are a lot of things that are
Mhm.
happening that people never ever thought could happen.
That's so true, Madhuri. You're absolutely right about the opacity. And what's, of course, interesting, we are focusing on the US, which is where all this stuff has been coming up and in the news. And eventually, I guess we are going to have a conversation that's about visas globally. I think it's been very easy to be comfortable with the way the visa processes work in the US, whereas, workers go to Saudi Arabia or to Gulf countries and to the UAE, and their stuff is, their passports are withheld, they are beaten, tortured. You have like all those domestic workers from the Philippines or Ethiopia who go off to various countries. I mean, they also go through visa processes, and we talk about them in all kinds of ways. And there's been a sort of sense of comfort and a sense of legality and a sense of justice around the way Europe and the US do their visas, and we've been comfortable with it. And now it's all, the upheaval is massive and it's crazy, and we are going into a tyrannical direction, and the entire fabric of things as we know it is about to be altered.
The only thing I want to say is that I think Bhakti, you say this tyranny of this. It's always been tyrannical. It's just that they have socialized us into accepting this tyranny, and some of us who are infinitely more privileged can travel with the sense that somehow our privilege allows us to be documented or legal. I think that socialization of power into power has been completely destroyed. And I think this is a wonderful moment to bring Tanvi on the podcast. It's an absolute honor and a pleasure to introduce Tanvi Misra. She's a writer, multimedia journalist, primarily covering immigration, urban policy, and criminal justice. Her work spans multiple genres and appeared in The Nation, The Atlantic, The Blaffler, The New Republic, and the list is quite long. Misra was the Ira Lipman Fellow at Columbia University and has many, many, many other fellowships and accolades to her wonderful long body of work. Thank you so much for joining us, Tanvi. It also feels like we've come a full circle. Almost 5 years ago, Tanvi Misra was part of the Polis Project's Dispatcher series during COVID, when we had an in-depth, deep dive into what the Biden presidency means for immigration policy. It feels like so much has happened between those years, but today I'm really glad that reporter Tanvi Misra is joining us. And thank you, Tanvi, and thanks for coming here.
Much for having me. And yeah, I'm glad we're having this conversation. That Ravi Raghubir conversation actually is quite relevant. We're going to be talking about. So yeah, just glad to be here.
Tanvi, thanks again for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about how immigration has become your sort of beat? How did you get into it, and what has motivated you?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's always a slightly difficult one to answer because it's a mix of things. I think, like a lot of us, my personal background has shaped my professional interests. My mother's family is from Kashmir, so border politics have always been a part of my life, and I think started shaping my coverage once I became a journalist. I also came here for college at 18, and for the better part of my time here, I have myself been in the immigration process, and been very intimate with what that bureaucracy looks like, and how confusing and baffling it is oftentimes. And so I think just recognizing that there was so much people didn't know about it, it felt like I was well situated to cover these stories, and not just the stories that seemed very, very similar to my own experience, but there is no one immigration story, and that is something I learned through my own reporting, but also wanted to translate and be able to convey to the world that there is an infinite number of experiences within this system. So that was really why I got into it, and being able to show aspects of that system and how it works is sort of the central, I think, motivating goal for my coverage.
Tanvi, your work is incredible and it's consistent. And over the years, it's sort of building up on these themes, showing us different sides, exposing different aspects of border regimes. I guess I don't know what else to call them. And of course, it's interesting to know that you have a sort of double outsider status, right? I mean, we're thinking about Kashmir, that identity, and then coming to the US and all the madness of that, in a sense. So, in your years publishing, in your years working as a journalist reporting, how did you find the media attitude towards your reporting? I mean, this is the sort of kind of podcast we do where we're talking a lot about media spin and media problems and trying to analyze and unpack and so on. So what do you think are the kind of stories that are picked up by more mainstream outlets, versus maybe alternative media? Is there a change recently in the kind of stories about the border and ICE detention centers? Is there a shift from like when Democrats are in power versus Trump is in power? You don't have to answer all of that, but just what are media kind of attitudes? What have you observed?
I think that's a really great question. And I think it's one of those areas that I rail about on Twitter or wherever else on social media, because there certainly is a shift from administration to administration. And I think, the media industry, like a lot of other institutions, really takes its cues from who is in power. Which is a source of frustration for me and a lot of other journalists who cover this beat, because this is a beat that has importance. It's a perennial importance, right? It's always important. It's always been important, especially in this country. But certainly around the world, this is something that is, it's informing a lot of the politics around the entire world, right? And not just the Western world, the entire world. So, and with climate change, with conflict, with the sort of the effects of extreme capitalism, we're going to be seeing more and more this beat gain relevance. But the frustration has always been that the resources and the interest really follows sort of the negative interest that might be, or the negative kind of spotlighting that this subject might be getting from a particular administration versus another. So we saw a lot of interest and a lot of like hiring around, of immigration reporters, and a lot of coverage when Trump first started running, because, again, this was his the centerpiece of his agenda, right? But then once the Biden administration took over, there were layoffs and there was not as much interest in immigration coverage. And, there's some things that are kind of structural. There's not a lot of support for immigration reporters, especially those who do come from immigrant backgrounds themselves. There's not a lot of like mental health support for freelancers in particular. It's really hard sometimes to be able to do the kind of reporting, whether that's investigative or narrative. The resources that you need for that kind of reporting are hard to come by. And so, so I will say, like, on the big picture here is that it sort of changes with the whims of what political, administration is in office. And that's always been a source of a little bit of frustration and I would say the one other thing within that is sometimes you have to kind of something I think about all the time is the nuances within my coverage. I don't want to cover this vast group of people who have this experience and who are extremely diverse, of diverse ideologies, diverse backgrounds, diverse resources, and in the same manner, or to paint them with the same brush as a monolith, right? And I don't want to only do stories which is like, oh, this bad thing is happening to this group of people, which tends to be the kind of story even when there is interest. These are the type of stories that sometimes editors are interested in, like what is the worst thing that's happening out there to this group of people. So I think balancing the need, the very real need to expose what is happening and to illuminate how this bureaucracy and these border regimes work, with also representing people that I'm covering about who are affected by this as humans, who also have capacity for joy, and are in full humans with their own interests and flaws, and all of that is sometimes very challenging, but something that I hope that we keep talking about as we keep covering this.
Tanvi, I love that you talked about the border regimes, but I also feel like the language that we use might not be a language that vast majority of Americans are familiar with. For instance, What is something you wish the American public understood about the process of, say, getting a visa or a green card? Do you even think they understand what a visa is or a green card is? And do you think there is some kind of public awareness about the idea around how difficult it is to have a legal status in this country?
Yeah, no, I don't think there is public awareness about that. In short, I think the things that I wish people understood is just how difficult, expensive,
Right.
and costly in other ways it is to actually be able to get the permission to come to this country and then the permission to stay, which becomes exponentially, the more you want to stay, the more exponentially costly it gets. And I say costly because it isn't just the lawyers fees and the application fees, but it's also costly in other ways. In You have to give up all of your privacy, for example, right? If when you're applying for a visa, a lot of people don't understand that there's actually several layers of selection going on, even in the country where people are applying from. So let's say India. There are medical clearances you have to get, right, before you apply. There are, in addition to all of the money that you have to pay, those things cost money, right? You have to get background clearances. That costs money. You have to get a host of, you have to submit all of your like bank statements. You have to
Yes.
make sure that you have a certain amount of money to be able to sustain yourself while you're in this country. And that is just for one type of visa. There's, these things keep getting compounded the more you want to stay, or the longer you want to stay, or the more permanently you want to stay. So it becomes exponentially harder. And the system is weeding out people who are poorer, who may have health issues or disabilities from the get-go, and people don't realize that. So the people who actually end up coming here, including some of us, already are able to afford to a large extent that system and the kind of cost that it imposes on us. And that really is something that people don't recognize, including immigrants, I would say, don't always recognize that we came here because we had the choice to come here versus intentionally being like, oh no, we came here the right way. It's
Yeah.
because we came here because we could afford to come here.
Yeah. Thanks, first of all, for laying out just how arduous and complicated the conditions are, because we see these almost futile distinctions between illegal and legal immigrants just being bandied about, without people understanding really the process of how hard it is to become documented. And despite being documented, how risky your status actually is. And that's something that's sort of come to light recently. And I just sort of wanted to ask, you've been reporting, speaking of like stripping people of their status and their green card status, which is a permanent immigration status. You've been reporting on this, movement for Palestine influencing the election and how it affected Harris's votes. And even in the in Harris's campaign, there was a particular kind of dehumanization of migrants. Obviously, Trump said, horrific things about Haitians or whatever. But Kamala was also talking about, going after drug cartel members and having this, strongest military in the world, all that kind of stuff. Um, have you seen this discourse around migration change in any significant way during the election? I will admit it's not that long ago, but it feels like a lifetime.
Yeah, I feel like the other thing, apart from, we discussed a little bit about media institutions and how they portray and convey these changes from administration to administration. I think, and I don't know what, it's sort of a chicken and egg situation, but it's the public opinion also kind of follows the rhetoric and the sort of media cues that they're getting, I guess. So it's very interesting because you saw all this narrative about kids in cages in the first Trump administration, and some of the same, the Biden administration kept some of the same policies in place at the border and had, a lot of like deportations within the country, etc. But you don't see the same level of outrage, the same level of, protests, reactions, even online, to the same extent. And that's always interesting. And I don't know exactly how to penetrate that difference and how to be able to explain it fully, but it's certainly something that I've seen from administration to administration. So now that we are seeing a Trump administration come back in power, certainly again there was this slight shift. I think it was a little bit more muted this time, perhaps because people I don't know. I mean, this is just anecdotally, right?
Yeah.
Muted system, and I don't know how much of that is just a little bit of desensitization, or a little bit of sort of empathy fatigue, or I don't know to what extent these things make up this reaction or the mutedness of it, but certainly, you saw similar like shifts again, like where it's like, oh, now it's going to be a problem, whereas some of us had been covering the same type of effects and the same type of impacts, even under the Biden administration, even under the Obama administration, for example. So I will say that I think what is different, though, is because and I hope that immigration journalists or anyone covering this is able to contextualize what we're seeing now. For example, I think it's the first time people are seeing how ICE does its arrests, right? We're seeing
Mm.
cases of these students. I don't think people have seen that visually before. And while it is a different group of immigrants being targeted, certainly it is unprecedented that these group of immigrants are being targeted. This is sort of how ICE, and you're seeing all this conversation about using the words disappeared and kidnapped and all of that. But something that I've been trying to, reiterate as much as I can is that this is actually par for course when it comes to ICE operations. This is how they often arrest undocumented people, undocumented families. And I've talked to numerous lawyers and numerous, immigrant families over the years where it's the same experience, where they don't know where their loved one is for a long period of time in ICE detention until it shows up in the detainee locator database, and that often takes a lag. So that sort of panic and worry, it's actually quite common and has been common under multiple administrations. That's one small insight into how some of these things, there are continuities, but the ways those powers have always existed, those MOs have always existed, but they're being used to an unprecedented degree in the
No,
last.
absolutely. I was just in some sort of an argument, I don't know, about, there's the constant, see, we told you Trump would be really bad. And I'm not a Trump supporter, but of course I knew how horrible he's going to be. But, um, and one of the arguments that I had back was, where do you think these ICE officers came from? Did they just get trained in the last 2 weeks, or have they been doing this? They seem to know what they're doing, right? And what we are in this kind of reign of the spectacular and this terror. They're instilling this terror. When we're seeing the videos, when we saw the horrible pictures of the Venezuelans who were deported, absolutely terrifying. And then, of course, the pro-Palestine stuff, it's already started. It's really hit home. I'm in academia. I've been a professor for many years, and it's just out of control. And as someone who has been running, for example, a website, has a YouTube with Warscapes, Radical Books Collective, of course, Polis, getting requests from people, can you take down my social media, can you take down this? It's hit the nail where it's supposed to, you know what I mean? It was aimed, and it got there. And a lot of these students who have been kidnapped by ICE have been permanent resident status. They have green cards, or they're very legal at the end of the day. And but the focus is on pro-Palestine or people associated with Palestine. The association is also so small in some way. So I don't know anymore. Documents, undocumented, documented, is there a distinction anymore? Who is safer? Are they coming now for just basic political imprisonment, even of US citizens? What do you see? What can you tell us? Help us.
That's a really good question. So I'll say a few things. One, there is a distinction legally between visa holders and green card holders, right? Visa holders are always sort of there's much broader authority to just revoke their visas and everything. Green
Right.
card holders do have certain rights that are similar to the rights of US citizens, and they have standing often to sue. So I'll just make that really clear distinction. What there isn't a distinction in is how easily the legal authority for also targeting them already exists. It has always existed. It has not been acted upon in the same way, but that has always existed. The other thing I'll make a note of is when it comes to legal, illegal, it has always been a kind of a blurry line, right? Governments can legalize and illegalize anyone they want, and those lines shift constantly. So I think the ways that people think about legal and legal are so set in stone, and I often want to just show them, even under Republican, under I believe it was Reagan, but there has been mass amnesty, quote unquote, of people who were asylum seekers, let's say. So that's the other thing. Asylum seekers, people think of them as, because they're coming to the country and knocking at its door, people think of them as illegal, and they're often characterized as such. But it is a legal process that's going on where they're allowed to come to the country legally per the law, any way that, and apply for this benefit or the status. It doesn't matter how they've come to the country. That is in the law, right? So it's technically legal, but people don't characterize it as such. The one other thing I will say, and this is something that I've been talking to consular officers and lawyers, is there is this vast amount of discretion that individual ICE agents, individual border agents, and individual State Department consular officers have. And so right now, what we're seeing, one of the sources that I speak to, the consular officer, recently told me the ideological screening hasn't even begun yet, because this is sort of like their bureaucratic culture. When your boss tells you from up top, you need to get your numbers up, it really depends from individual to individual how they do that. So it may be the case you get someone at the border who's like personally, on a personal capacity, a Trump supporter, and they think someone saying, so a picture may be like construed as like an anti-Trump picture. So they might revoke your visa there, right? For those reasons. We've seen one case like that. But another person may have a different interpretation. So I think what is scary is the level of, for people who do have, who are not citizens, and that doesn't matter what kind of status you have right now. As long as you're not a citizen, you can be at the whims of these individual officers, essentially. Yeah. Right, especially at the border when they have extended rights, right? Extended rights to search your phone, to search your person, etc., and take you to secondary, etc. So I think that is something I want to really emphasize, is that now we're seeing more and more over the last week, in fact, that those sort of foundations for ideological screening are starting to be put in place more specifically. But before that, all the stuff that you were seeing, that was actually just individual officers making decisions based on what they think their bosses want, right? So given the large amount of discretion, then you have the ideological screening. It makes it a very, very scary system.
And this screening is entirely AI based, right? They're just going to implement those programs. How is it working? Do you know anything?
Yeah, so I would say some of the sources I've spoken to are a little skeptical about the extent to which AI will be used. But what we do know from some of the court cases that are happening, specifically, Momodu Tal, the Cornell student who sued the government, in his case, there was some declarations that local ICE field officers and local government officials had made, where they say that actually the ICE department that's not actually even supposed to do these things. They are more in charge of transnational crime. So they go after or typically are supposed to go after drug traffickers and, labor traffickers and, cartels, basically. They are being told now to sit in front of a laptop, go on Google and look for open source information to basically adhere to or implement the executive orders that the president has put in place. Mm-hmm. So they're actually just Googling people and finding news articles or social media. And then they are approaching, or at least in the case of Momodu Tal, it was ICE that approached State Department and said, do you think his visa could be revoked?
This is
So,
bad. This
so
is so bad. This is
this
much worse than I thought, actually.
Yeah, same
And
actually.
it's so arbitrary. It's so arbitrary.
right, and so I would say the AI stuff is we don't know as much yet. So I wouldn't like. I think I would just say that they're saying that they are also using AI, but some of the sources that I've spoken to think that that is a way to sanitize or try to portray this image that there is no bias involved, right? Because AI and some of these algorithms are often used as a way as if they have no bias and no back end sort of
What?
um, settings, right? There's no human. So it sort of almost makes it seem like this is a more objective process than maybe it is in real life. But also, I will just say we don't know the extent of which they are using
Mhm.
AI. They say they're using it. They may be using it in some cases, but it seems like it's a mix of things at the moment.
Yeah. Tanvi, I just sort of wanted to switch tracks a little bit and talk about there are some legal challenges that are pending, and I was wondering if you could sort of explain maybe one or two of them, specifically by green card holders. I know you said that they have this particular right to sue the administration, and their statuses are being revoked. As you said, they are being legalized, punished for their positions. Their First Amendment rights are being violated. We are seeing, obviously, tangentially, this is not a part of the conversation, but just for our listeners, that lawyers and law firms are being targeted and are making also these horrific deals with the administration. So I was wondering if you could just comment on sort of some of those legal challenges by, by status holders in this country, and do you feel what do you feel the outcomes of this could be, and how do you think that that could affect any future sort of detention, searching, ideological, filtering, as you put it? Yeah, could you comment on that a bit?
So I will say Mahmoud Khalid's case was the first one that came to light, right?
Yeah,
And that is a specific case because in that case, what happened was that they filed a habeas petition,
Yeah.
which is challenging the detention of a person. And that is what is being debated in court right now. They've also filed emergency motions to release him, given that his wife is 8 months pregnant and he's not a flight risk, et cetera, et cetera. So there's some parallel things going on there. He also has an immigration case right now. The court has said that he cannot be deported. But that case, the immigration consequences are on a parallel track, and they're going to be worked out, on a parallel track. But his case, along with the Korean green card holding student, also from Colombia.
yeah.
I think they are going to be sort of uh, the pioneering cases around the extent to which both sort of the executive can make immigration decisions about legal immigrants, but also because they are being challenged on First Amendment rights, they are going to ultimately become tests for what extent immigrants have rights in general, right? Especially these rights to free expression, to academic freedom, and all of that, right? So and the reason I say that they are going to become is because those legalities have not been worked out.
Mhm.
Right.
This
Yeah.
is uncharted waters in terms of, again, like I said, the legal authorities have always been there on the books. This is what sources told me when I was reporting around this in the last 2 weeks, is the legal authorities have always been on the books, but using them against a green card holder is
Yeah.
not precedented, right?
Yeah.
So because of that, they are being tested on, now, like I said, green card holders do have certain rights. They have in the past, when they've been used against people who are more vulnerable, like visa holders, etc. Right?
Mhm.
So green card holders, why are do they have a slightly more rights? They have deep community, right? They have deep ties to communities and institutions in the United States. They have some rights just legally as well, rights to based on case law. So I think that's why this is such an something where we don't really know what's going to happen.
Mm.
It may go up to the Supreme Court. It may, it's sort of on a it may be that this is something that ends up there, and that is where all of this is decided, or some of it is decided and other, is sort of left to, but it could take months or even, I don't know, longer for some of these issues to be resolved. But potentially, Khalil is released before then, but the larger legal questions, I don't think we're going to see resolution for a little while.
Mhm.
I will just say one note about some of the other lawsuits that have come up, in particular Tal's and the one by Chung, the Korean student, also has a First Amendment argument. And
Yeah.
I think those lawsuits are dealing, again, they're trying to get the courts to say that the executive orders that all of this is based on are illegal because they target
Right.
protected speech. So there is a huge First Amendment question here that is
Exactly.
coming up in all of the lawsuits, but some might tackle it first, some might tackle it. It depends on sort of how the lawsuits are framed and filed. But certainly, like that is a huge issue in all of these. And given that the First Amendment, it's the First Amendment, right? It's one of the central sort of ideals that this country tries to say is the fabric of its society. I think the fact that that is being tested, and we don't know how that's going to end up, means that the fabric of the society is potentially up, or if not already, is being transformed through these cases and through these legal pushback against them. The one other thing I will say is I did speak to a historian recently, Julia Rose Kraut, who has written a book on ideological exclusion and deportations and immigration being used against people who are considered radicals. And the one other thing I will say, which I thought was really interesting, is that some of these authorities historically have been used against people considered "quote unquote" radical Jews. Um,
Exactly.
and so they were actually used against Jewish people.
Yeah.
But they were used to block them from coming to the country, or but the fact that they are now being used against people who are for pro-Palestinian speech and activism, again, those things were there. There are people who did pro-Palestinian activism who were screened and ideologically screened before, but the way that they're going after green card holders again is not precedented. So we're going to see how that ends up, but that's how things are for the moment.
Something that keeps coming to me when you speak about all of this is there been reporting that connects people who are profiting from this system? For example, if you're taking a more comparative approach in India with Assam and the detention centers, they were private contractors who were benefiting from this. Every time in history, when groups of people have been rounded up for some kind of incarceration, there is someone. I don't see a lot of reporting coming out of that. In your, I mean, not who is right now benefiting from this kind of incarceration, deportations? Who are the private entities involved? Second, why aren't we seeing more of reporting coming out about these entities benefiting from this inhuman detentions and incarcerations?
Yeah, there has always been a few private prison companies and you'll see if you look at their stocks, the minute Trump it was clear that he was going to win the election, they spiked, right? This happens all the time. But there's a couple of private prison companies that have a lot of the ICE contracts. And not only do they have ICE contracts, they also have their subsidiaries do their alternatives to detention programs. So they have these technological, basically ankle monitors and other devices to monitor people who are not in detention. Of course, now you're seeing, so even under the Biden administration, these were the guys who were getting the contracts, right? And these were the guys who were profiting even from their alternative to detention program. But what you often see, and what we saw last time and what we're seeing this time, is that they're trying to get more and more, some of the contracts already exist and they're sort of dormant, quote unquote, but they come online once the quotas grow up, arrest quotas grow up and the detention quotas grow up. Right now we're seeing almost 50,000 people in ICE detention. They don't have, as my Baltimore story demonstrated, they don't have the space for these people. And what they're likely going to do, as they did last time in the case of border facilities. I'm sure you guys remember from last time, the border facilities were really crowded. There were children who were separated who were there, and there were a lot of lawsuits around the standards in which these children were being held. And there are the border customs and border protections argument at the time was, well, we don't have enough money to transfer them out, process and transfer them out quickly enough, right? So give us more money and we'll put in more rights, essentially, or we'll make sure the rights exist. And I think that is a similar argument that they're making right now to Congress, is to give them more money to be able to do that, to be able to, again, pay these private contractors a little bit more, get more, not just private contractors, but actually county jails have contracts with ICE where, county jails, when mass incarceration started to drop or whatever, their jails and prisons started to hollow out, right? So those are waiting. This was a way for them to then recapitalize on and be able to refinance those facilities for a different population, essentially. So those things are all, they are, county jails, but private, especially those big, the difference between the county jails and the big private facilities is the size. They are just, county jails are smaller, private facilities are huge, right? So those are all the Geo Group, Core Civic, there's a few others. They are the ones who really benefit from this. And the one other thing I will add here, because I covered some research a few years ago, and I'm hoping to see if there's some update to that. But something very interesting that came out in this research was that if you have a private prison facility, a private detention facility for immigrants in your district, in your congressional district, you are more likely to support anti-immigrant legislation, regardless of your political. So controlling for ideology, right?
Wow.
So that means if you have one, it goes up. If you have two, it goes up more.
My God.
So this was some research that was done, I believe in 2018. So I'm curious to see how that has changed, if at all. But there is evidence to suggest that it's not even so much the direct funding from some of these, and these private prison companies do donate to congressional, to lawmakers essentially in their campaigns. But it's actually the physical presence of these detention centers tend to influence congressional policy.
Yeah.
And that's, something that I think people overlook.
Of course, the confluence of the economic and the ideological is always so grotesque. I wanted to return to some of the kind of media attitudes around it, because you mentioned your Baltimore story, which I found quite difficult to read, and it must have been hard for you to be in there and to see all these people suffering, the overcrowding, the horrific conditions, the what seemed like torture, basically. And I just, there are these moments of eruption, like, the children in cages. When Trump was first in power, the first round of his presidency, everyone was talking about that. My God, this is so shocking, so bad. Obama had been doing it too, but of course we got to see something more. But in general, there are these little eruptions, but then, I don't know, there's a general desensitization or maybe empathy fatigue. And I don't know, how do you work with that? And do you think there is some sort of a fatigue like that? And do you think that the media is influenced by that, by not assigning stories? How does the attention economy, empathy economy work?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a great answer, because it's something that I think about constantly, and I don't think I figured out the solution to this. But certainly, I think, one of the debates that I have with other journalists is to the extent that our reporting, when we expose, especially images, right, images of suffering and dying immigrants, children, how does that change public opinion, if at all? And I get into pretty contentious debates about this with other journalists. I don't think it does. I think they actually, especially like explicit images, and again, this is
Look at Gaza. Look at Gaza.
look at Gaza, and you remember Ayan Kurdi, the child who
Yeah.
was found,
course.
so that became sort of memeified, right? There were so many like representations of it, etc. It was, I think, the way that, and I don't know if this is any individual institution's fault per se, but the way that our information ecosystem functions, the ways these images circulate, and the way that they are consumed in mass, right? They're just like sort of, and you take it and then you scroll on and it's like your friend who's having a birthday or something, right?
Yeah.
The way that disconnect and that sort of jarring nature of how that information is consumed, I think, tends to, I argue, promote the dehumanization of. So that's why, like, there are some ethical considerations around how news organizations contribute or don't contribute to this. There are news organizations that have very, very strong, this is the other thing. I was talking to my students. I teach journalism at CUNY, and we were talking about, how it's these suffering and dying people of sort of images of these suffering and dying people. It's almost always marginalized groups, right? You don't see, if there was such images of mass suffering of Americans and white Americans in particular, let's say, as one example, that would not be shown by news organizations, because it would be an affront to the dignity of these people or whatever, or it'd be seen as such, right? But there is a normalization that this just happens to Black and brown people, right?
Yeah.
This is the way the world is. And I think that consciously or unconsciously is a part of the ecosystem. I will say some, media organizations do have conversations about the ethics, and individual journalists certainly do. I think there are, in some places, rules that you cannot show like a dead child, for example, like, that their family may have not seen themselves that image of that person.
Yeah.
So I think these are ongoing conversations. It's certainly, I have very strong opinions about it, but there are people who disagree, and they say, well, if you don't expose this, you don't show people, that this is happening, how are people going to know about it? And I take that point, but I think my counter argument is who are we showing it to? Who are we trying to convince here, right? Who's our audience here that we have in our mind when we're thinking about this? And if it hasn't worked so far, why do we think it's going to work from here on?
Yeah.
Tanvi, thank you so much for making time, but also it felt like we just got schooled in things that we thought we knew, but then we realized that there is so much that's happening. And I really appreciate your work, but also this consistent reporting and getting us the information that otherwise many of us would not know. Again, thank you so much for making the time. And again, I hope you continue doing this work. Your work remains important. It also remains a ray of hope for many people who often feel frustrated by the lack of information about our communities and what's happening to them. Thank you.